On April 8th, the world held its breath as a historic ceasefire was supposed to freeze the explosive war between the U.S., Israel, and Iran. But just hours later, the skies over Lebanon erupted. How did a fragile truce instantly ignite a violent new front? And more importantly, what forced the superpowers to the negotiating table in the first place? The answer involves a devastating decapitation strike, a crippled global economy, and a terrifying regional retaliation that the public was never fully warned about. Welcome back to TrendCanvas. Today we are giving you the complete, uncensored recap of the 2026 Middle East War. We're breaking down the sheer violence of Operation Epic Fury, Iran's shocking counteroffensive that dragged in neighboring Gulf nations, the worst global oil crisis since the 1970s, and the fatal flaw in the April ceasefire that shifted the war to the streets of Beirut. This is the timeline of the conflict that changed the world. It all started on February 28th. Concluding that diplomacy had entirely failed, the United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury. It was staggering in scale. Over 13,000 targets struck in a relentless campaign aimed at Iranian military command and missile infrastructure. But the opening salvo was what truly shocked the world. Relying on CIA intelligence, a highly coordinated strike hit a leadership gathering in Tehran. In a matter of hours, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, the defense minister, and the head of the IRGC were all assassinated. Washington and Jerusalem anticipated a paralyzed Iran, banking on the fact that severing the head of the regime would end the threat. But they vastly underestimated the response. The multinational target list. Iran didn't collapse. They did the unthinkable. Instead of a localized defense, Iran launched a massive multi-front retaliation. They unleashed hundreds of ballistic missiles and armed drones, not just at Israel, but striking 27 U.S. bases across the entire region. Suddenly, the broader Arab world was caught in the crossfire. A Shahed drone struck a hotel in Dubai. Abu Dhabi's airport was hit, causing casualties, and air defenses lit up the skies over Doha. Bahrain's Fifth Fleet headquarters and Kuwait's airport were severely targeted. Financial capitals went into shelter mode as airspace closed across the Gulf. The conflict was no longer isolated. The war had instantly expanded to the doorsteps of the West's wealthiest allies. But Iran's most devastating move wasn't just military, it was economic. They targeted the global lifeline, the Strait of Hormuz. By heavily mining this critical choke point, which handles nearly a third of the world's seaborne traded crude oil, Iran effectively strangled international shipping overnight. It triggered the biggest global oil supply disruption since the 1970s energy crisis. Global markets panicked, gas prices skyrocketed, and the U.S. military was forced to urgently deploy naval destroyers just to clear the mines and keep the world economy from completely freezing. The public was told it was a surgical military strike, but the reality was a sudden, global economic collapse. By early April, the immense toll, thousands dead, a devastating parallel cyber war that took Iran offline, and crushing global economic pressure, forced a pause. Brokered through international mediation, a highly fragile temporary ceasefire was announced on April 8th to bring the U.S. and Iran to the negotiating table. But there was a massive crack in this diplomatic foundation. What about the proxy networks that had already joined the fight to avenge Khamenei? Just hours after the truce was announced, that fatal flaw was violently exposed. Citing Hezbollah's heavy involvement following the assassination in Tehran, Israel launched its heaviest bombardment of Lebanon since the conflict began. Targeting infrastructure across the country, especially in Beirut, the unannounced strikes completely upended the peace momentum. The sheer volume of the bombardment displaced over 1/6 of Lebanon's entire population almost overnight. Behind closed doors, Washington and Jerusalem were divided over whether Lebanon was even included in the truce, shifting the epicenter of the war in the blink of an eye. To truly understand the anatomy of this war, we have to step away from the maps, the satellite imagery, and the cold, hard statistics of military strike packages. We have to look at the psychological whiplash of what it actually felt like on the ground. Because modern geopolitical warfare is not just fought with fifth-generation fighter jets and ballistic missiles. It is fought in the minds of the billions of people watching their world unravel in real time, scrolling through a timeline of a collapsing global order. Think back to the final days of February. The world was already on edge, but the illusion of stability was still somewhat intact. When Operation Epic Fury began, it didn't just break the sound barrier. It broke the psychological safety net of the entire Middle East. Imagine being a civilian in Tehran on the night of February 28th. You aren't watching a military briefing, you are simply living your life. Suddenly the power grid fails. The sky, normally dark, is violently illuminated by a terrifying, silent flash, followed seconds later by a concussive shockwave that shatters every window in your district. In the span of a single night, the unquestioned, decades-long authority of the regime's supreme command was simply erased from existence. But it wasn't just the regime that was plunged into darkness. The simultaneous cyber warfare campaign severed the country's internet. Families were cut off from each other. The uncertainty was weaponized. In those first 48 hours, nobody knew if this was a surgical strike or the beginning of a total, apocalyptic invasion. But the true shockwave wasn't confined to the borders of Iran. The retaliation shattered the grand illusion of the Gulf's impenetrable wealth. For years, cities like Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and Doha operated as the untouchable playgrounds of global finance, neutral zones where money shielded you from the realities of the region's ancient conflicts. When Iran's drone swarms and ballistic missiles bypassed defenses and struck the U.S. installations embedded within these wealthy nations, that shield evaporated. Imagine the sheer panic on the trading floors. Imagine expatriates and foreign investors who believed they were miles away from the front lines, suddenly waking up to the wail of air raid sirens and the sight of Patriot missile interceptors streaking over luxury penthouses. Iran's message was chillingly clear. If we burn, you burn with us. They fundamentally rewrote the rules of engagement. They proved that the United States could no longer launch an offensive from the safety of Allied territory without those allies paying a devastating, immediate price. The conflict instantly transformed from a localized retaliation into a regional hostage situation. And then came the silent strangulation of the global economy. This is where the war reached into the homes of people who couldn't even point to the Strait of Hormuz on a map. We live in an interconnected world where a single bottleneck dictates the survival of global industry. When the IRGC seeded the strait with naval mines and threatened to incinerate any commercial vessel that crossed the threshold, they didn't just strike a military target. They held the modern world hostage. 30% of the world's seaborne crude oil frozen. Almost overnight, the ripple effects were catastrophic. Imagine the domino effect. It wasn't just numbers ticking up on a stock exchange. It was the logistics companies grounding their fleets. It was the cost of agricultural transport skyrocketing, immediately spiking the price of food in supermarkets in London, Tokyo, and New York. It was the desperate panic at gas stations as rationing protocols were whispered about in government halls. The United States and Israel had calculated the military cost of assassinating a leader, but they had utterly failed to account for the economic kamikaze strategy of a wounded regime with nothing left to lose. The world was suddenly staring down the barrel of an inflation crisis that threatened to topple governments thousands of miles away from the actual fighting. By early April, the pressure was unsustainable. The global economy was bleeding out, and the civilian death toll was mounting. The world desperately needed a pause. And so, the Islamabad negotiations birthed the April ceasefire. For a brief, fleeting moment, there was a collective exhale. The headlines screamed about a diplomatic breakthrough. People started checking the news less obsessively. Families who had spent weeks sleeping in hardened shelters or basements finally walked out into the sunlight. The narrative being pushed by international media was one of de-escalation, of cooler heads prevailing. But this is the most cynical, tragic reality of modern geopolitical warfare. While the diplomats in Islamabad were shaking hands for the cameras, drafting frameworks for a localized peace, the military strategists back in Washington and Jerusalem were already looking at the next map. The ceasefire wasn't a genuine pursuit of peace. It was a tactical reload. It was an attempt to freeze the fire on one front simply because it was burning out of control, ignoring the fact that the embers had already been carried by the wind. Which brings us to the ultimate betrayal of that fragile hope. The pivot to Lebanon on April 8th. Just as the world was told the guns were falling silent, the skies over Beirut tore open. The psychological devastation of this moment cannot be overstated. Imagine surviving a regional panic, believing the worst is finally over, only to have the epicenter of the war forcefully relocated to your doorstep without a moment's notice. Israel, citing the mobilization of proxy forces, unleashed a barrage that Lebanon had not seen in a generation. The peace talks were instantly overshadowed by the plumes of gray smoke rising from residential districts. Hundreds of thousands of civilians were displaced in a matter of hours, clogging the highways, fleeing a war they thought had just ended. This is the harsh, unforgiving truth of this entire conflict. Stopping the war machine on one front often requires feeding it on another. The April ceasefire exposed a fatal flaw in global diplomacy. Treaties are only as strong as the fine print. And in the fine print of the Islamabad agreement, Lebanon was left completely undefended. The United States and Iran tried to patch a leaking dam, while an entirely separate, devastating flood was unleashed next door. The events from February to April of 2026 shattered every preconceived notion we had about modern conflict. It proved that in the 21st century, there is no such thing as a contained or surgical war. A single strike in Tehran can paralyze a shipping lane in the Gulf, which spikes the cost of living in Europe, which forces a rushed ceasefire, which ultimately sacrifices a city like Beirut. It is a terrifying, interconnected web of cause and effect. And as the dust settles, or rather as the dust simply moves from one destroyed city to the next, the world is left to grapple with a chilling realization. The superpowers thought they were the architects playing a grand game of chess, but Operation Epic Fury and its aftermath proved that once the first piece is moved, the board itself catches fire. And the people left to burn are rarely the ones who lit the match. Geopolitics shifts by the hour, and mainstream narratives often leave out the full picture. We are dedicated to bringing you the clear, unbiased realities behind these global events. If this complete recap opened your eyes to the true scale of the crisis, hit that subscribe button to support TrendCanvas and stay informed on our next deep dive. As the dust settles over Beirut, the diplomatic scramble continues. Direct ceasefire talks are now being pushed as a desperate attempt to disarm the borders. But with the Gulf states recovering from drone strikes, the global economy still reeling from the Strait of Hormuz blockade, and a new supreme leader stepping up in Iran, the damage is already done. Will diplomacy finally catch up to the airstrikes, or is this just the calm before the next storm? Thank you for watching TrendCanvas. We'll see you in the next one.